Good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy to once again thank you for joining us for this important event at an incredibly critical time for our country and the entire international community. We've gathered together at the dawn of a new decade, and at this moment, it's become clearer that the 21st century will be defined by a singular competition. A competition not of technology or of weaponry, but of ideas. Ideas about how to solve problems and what is the best way for societies to do so. I believe the 21st century will be defined by a competition between democracy and authoritarianism. And while this competition may not have the same military consequences of the Cold War that unfolded between democracy and communism, it is similarly a competition to define the future of the world. As we all know, there are two distinct and opposing poles in this debate. On the one end is the United States and many of our European allies, and on the other end, the countries of China and Russia. And as we should all recognize, China is not passive in this debate. It is assertively making the case for its form of government on the global stage in Africa, Latin America, and the rest of Asia. It argues that its form is more adaptive and effective, better able to address challenges like poverty and climate change. And if we really want to be honest with ourselves, there are days our country's erratic behavior makes China's case very well. And yet, despite the sharply defined poles of this competition, our world is perhaps more complicated than at any other point, because this competition is not only occurring between countries, it's taking place within countries as well. Over the past few decades, after the past few years, democracies themselves have witnessed the rise of leaders with authoritarian impulses like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has weakened the press and judiciary. In India, our world's largest democracy, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has championed a citizenship law discriminating against members of the Muslim community, a move that echoes the disgraceful Muslim ban in the United States. In our own country, the President of the United States has attacked our federal judges, declared free press an enemy of the people, and undermined election after election. To say that President Trump is a friend or a faithful steward of our Constitution and democracy might be something of a stretch. And yet, it's not just democracies that are facing challenges from within. Indeed, even as democracies grapple with this rise of authoritarian populism, autocratic states have also experienced growing political protests demanding greater political freedoms. Largely peaceful demonstrations have brought down dictators in Algeria and Sudan, and protesters have also flooded the streets of Hong Kong, Moscow, and just this past weekend throughout Iran. The protesters in all these very different countries are united by their opposition to political repression and by their pleas and demands for the very simple right to have a say in their own political future. Indeed, in a world where wars between nations are thankfully rare, the battle between authoritarianism and democracy may be moving within nations, not just between them. And so I want to make a simple plea to this very esteemed group. It is to move beyond realpolitik and neutrality. We are fortunate to count so many dispassionate scholars and leaders in this audience, and I appreciate the call for analytical detachment. But this is a moment for choosing. So I ask you to consider moving beyond that realpolitik to defend democracy abroad. And as importantly, here at home, there are so many moments in our history where today's realism looks very much like tomorrow's hypocrisy. We must, of course, reject the dangerous unilateralism pursued by Donald Trump, who speaks admiringly of foreign dictators while insulting and alienating our allies. Instead, we must, and this is so obviously true, ensure that strengthening cooperation with our democratic allies stands as a core pillar of our foreign policy agenda. This includes joining with our partners to defend our collective democratic institutions against interference from authoritarian states. And unfortunately, we have more news of that happening today. And we also must stand up for fundamental human rights. But in order for the United States to uphold democratic values abroad, we must fully embrace them here at home. Indeed, other countries take note when we don't live our values, whether it is widespread use of voter suppression tactics or ever-present political corruption. Our government must enact bold solutions to help advance the fundamental promise of this nation, that every single person deserves a meaningful chance to earn a better life, to receive equal treatment under our laws, and to take part in our democracy. Because at the end of the day, what most fundamentally weakens democracies from within is the idea that democracies no longer deliver results for their people. That view breeds a cynicism that is crippling. And so we must repair and revitalize our own democracy. When we invest in our people, in education, in research, in infrastructure, and healthcare, we both deliver results for our people and strengthen ourselves for that competition with China. So, it is 2020. This year will represent a pivotal moment in the history of the United States. It can help forge a new progressive agenda in foreign policy and domestic policy that tackles the great challenges of our time. And in the foreign policy arena, that means taking on the urgent threat posed by climate change, to end America's unnecessary wars, and returning us to diplomacy with Iran. CAP is incredibly grateful for the partnership of all the people in this room, not today, but for days, weeks, and months to come. And I have to say, when I think of the people who have propelled that fight for democracy and human rights towards the core of our foreign policy, I can think of no one better to make that case than our special guest for our next keynote session, Ambassador Samantha Power. From 2013 to 2017, she served as our nation's 28th permanent representative to the United Nations. In that time, she played a pivotal role in shaping America's response to every major international issue, from opposing Russian aggression in Syria and Ukraine, to enacting sanctions against North Korea and ending the Ebola crisis. Since the conclusion of the Obama administration, Ambassador Power has served as a professor of global leadership, public policy, and human rights at the Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Law School. And last year, she published a memoir, The Education of an Idealist, which was hailed as one of 2019's most notable books by outlets such as The Economist, Washington Post, and the New York Times. And let me just say, it was a fantastic read. We're so honored that Ambassador Power could be here today for our keynote conversation on the power of progressive national security. So please welcome back to the stage Kelly Magsamen, and please help me give a very warm round of applause for Ambassador Samantha Power.
Thank you all. Hope everyone had a good lunch and good breakout sessions. Ambassador Power, welcome
Great to be here.
CAP's National Security Conference, the first 100 days. You're an astute person who's experienced the first 100 days of an administration and all of the rest of the administration as well, so we look forward to your perspectives. First, I want to mention your new book, The Education of an Idealist. There are periods of that book that I feel like I lived with you through, so it was nice to see it written down so in such a compelling and personal way. One of the themes that comes up throughout the book is how to advance your ideals and navigate a very complex national security bureaucracy, which many of us in this room have lived through and see the sort of ups and downs of process. How do you get things done to reflect your values and your ideals? I think many people in this room have big ambitions around a big progressive foreign policy agenda, but there's always friction, right, throughout that. So I would love your reflections on that for the room.
Sure. First of all, thank you. It's great to see. It's like a big reunion. A lot of people I haven't even seen since that fateful day in January 2017 when everything changed, a galaxy far, far away. So it's great to be back in that galaxy. I guess I'd maybe divvy up the answer into two parts. Where I landed after 8 years of learning on the job in the executive branch, I sort of encapsulate in the book in an expression that I borrow from a couple professors, a Stanford and Duke professor, the Heath brothers, and the expression is shrink the change. And the best example I can offer of that, which I offer in the book, is, it isn't the Trump years that brought about the democracy recession. They contributed, they're accelerating it, they're helping fuel it. America is now part of the democracy recession. But we were living that for all of the years of the Obama administration. I mean, we're now 13 straight years of freedom in decline around the world. And you and I were in jobs, many of the people in this room were in jobs with that portfolio, and it was maddening. And we were trying lots of different tactics to try to chip away at that problem, gathering civil society, creating instruments at the UN like special rapporteurs on freedom of association and things like that, and then working on discrete human rights issues. But sitting with my much more creative younger members of my team in 2015, we came up with this idea of a very modest campaign called #FreeThe20, which was our way of taking this huge problem of freedom in decline around the world and the resurgence of nationalism and populism, of a xenophobic flair in many circumstances, but turning it just into something very concrete that we could actually conceivably achieve. And I don't think we thought even that we would achieve all that much, but we thought we would, in profiling 20 women, female political prisoners around the world, that we would at least make their families know that America cared, that it would reach them in jail, that their leaders would know there was at least some reputational cost. And in the end, thanks to the work of many people in this room and others, and actually 20 female US senators, because as it happened, there were 20 female US senators at the time in the US Senate who, on a bipartisan basis, threw their weight behind the campaign. 16 of the 20 women were freed from jail. And so when you ask how do you get things done, we didn't solve last I checked, we didn't make even much of a dent in the freedom recession, but we did something concrete. It was proof of concept. It then morphed into other campaigns that were, again, about very discrete causes, but sometimes, you can define yourself out of meaningful action because, especially now, where issues like climate change, you just by definition feel so small, even if you have a very influential role in a future administration. So that's at a policy level. I guess what I would say for now that we're in this period of not even having the ability to do things like make a list of prisoners and try to get them out of jail, even something that modest, I feel like now it's each of our responsibility as we work toward a change in November 2020 that then takes form on January 20th, 2021. But I feel like a lot of terms have been thrown around, like rebuilding trust and restoring alliances. And I wasn't in the breakout sessions, and I'm sure it got much more concrete. But I think one thing that we can do now, those of you who have strong and thick and longstanding relationships with other countries, is we need to answer the question of actually what will it take to not rebuild trust, because of course we know it won't be rebuilt overnight, but what are the kinds of very discrete and shrink the change, doable, achievable measures that would land with outsized influence, with other countries. I mean, for some, it's a visit, a cabinet level visit, even early, might make a difference. I'm like, for some it's, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but just resubmitting our papers for the Paris Agreement, and then that will take hold and come into effect 30 days after we do so. But I think when I talk to young people, I often say, when they say, "Oh, what can I do? I want to make a difference in the world," and I'd say, "Know something about something." It feels like now we have a real responsibility to know how to alter the ecosystem, like the things that are within our control, as Dennis or someone said earlier. But let's use the time we have to hear from others what will make a dent. And then comparably, we talk a lot about, you asked the great question earlier to the previous panel about how to create foreign policy. I don't want to paraphrase you, but a foreign policy that is, that resonates with a domestic constituency or that has domestic appeal. That is not entirely knowable because people are different all around the country, and it depends on what subsection of the American public one is thinking about. But that would be another really good way to use our time right now, is to understand, we've talked about it, I think, in the China context. How do you walk that line in selling domestic mobilization around R&D investments, around AI investments, around renewal of and complete rebuilding of our diplomatic corps? How do you, what is the sweet spot there on China where it's not merely the return, as we were just talking about, not merely a return to sort of a Cold War enemy that brings about that domestic mobilization, but that it leaves space also for the areas of cooperation that we know we need? What is that sweet spot? Some of you have been listening to John Favreau on Pod Save America, or now The Wilderness, who's been going around the country, and he found himself very surprised to hear among independents and swing state swing voters how much it surprisingly mattered to people that we had lost the respect of people around the world, or that we feel alone, like people in that, again, interesting middle. It's one thing about traditional Democratic voters, but actually people who change their party affiliation from election to election, they just kind of feel like it's it's not good to have your respect and your favorability ratings plummet. Well, that's interesting, and that will have a ramifications for the next administration, and again, how they package what we're doing. But it'd be great to drill into, we know then that that's an issue that might resonate, but then what's the remedy? What are the messages that would really land? And maybe it's not this community who is best positioned to do that. I mean, I certainly don't feel like I'm particularly good at that, at knowing how to bridge those differences. But if we've learned anything, we in every sort of discussion like this among foreign policy experts, someone brings up the need to do that. And so where's the work being done to, in a very, very specific way, run through each of the issues and figure out how to get the most domestic bang for your buck so that you can sell all the wonderful things that your breakout sessions decided we needed to do?
That's great. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So if you were in charge of the world and you were looking around all the big priorities, because we have no shortage of priorities, right? Climate change, ending the wars, rebuilding that respect. What would making a dent look like to you? And what would be your first big muscle movements, policy decisions, and moves that you would maybe consider in the first 100 days? For a modest, just a little bit of a cop-out, only because you did ask that question of others. I will try not to repeat what others have said, and I did sit in on Jake's China breakout session as well, and so heard a number of great ideas in that space. I guess I would say I would start with and I will repeat a little bit, but try to offer something that I didn't hear. I'd start with the enabling environment, and again, back to the kind of ecosystem. So that's where what others have referred to as the diplomatic blitz, but the trust blitz, which that enabling environment, I mean, what one does on North Korea or the South China Sea will so turn, and the power of our messaging in terms of our diplomacy vis-a-vis China will turn on our success in building, I don't even want to say rebuilding, because it will, by definition, look different now, but building a new relationship with the Republic of Korea by injecting far more trust into the relationship with Japan. It goes without saying that our European partners' heads are exploding and have been for now some time. And so that's part of the enabling environment, is just somehow, again, you're not going to solve it all in the first 100 days or even the first term, but retrieving America's word, America's credibility, the legitimacy of our actions, retrieving their sense that we have systems and processes, some of the things that Dennis was talking about, but projecting that so that they
I mean, there's just going to be a huge amount of PTSD, right, in our interlocutors who are, for the first year of this administration, did the normal things. They would go and meet with the senior director for this and the assistant secretary for that, and then at a certain point, they just realized these people have no idea what Trump is about to do about anything. And so as we rebuild our systems, also projecting and restoring confidence of that nature, not just in our word and whether our word matters or our future agreements matter. So that's part of the enabling environment. The personnel issues that Michelle Flournoy and others talked about, in terms of our diplomatic corps, I don't need to say much more than that, but just not to put a finer point on it, 225,000 U.S. personnel, U.S. Pentagon personnel serve overseas today. 225,000, 9,000 diplomats. 225,000 to 9,000. It's just one example of something, again, that long predated Trump, but that maybe Trump gives us an excuse to breathe new life into. And there's a set of signals that you could send early on. Climate, of course, we'd be depositing our instruments of re-accession, I suppose, and that would be very welcome. But I think on climate, not only the breaking down of silos that we talked about in the China breakout, within our domestic institutions and the breaking down of the domestic foreign policy silos that we know exist, but also thinking through what the pathway to Paris 2.0 is. And maybe the climate people will say, well, it's far too soon, like we haven't even sat down with China yet, and what is that even going to look like? But I think for us to say to the world, we know we've lost 4 years. Here's how mayors and governors in the private sector and Mike Bloomberg have made a dent in our absence. But we're with you in recognizing, we remember that Paris was always a floor and that we have to make up for lost time. And then, of course, the set of domestic executive orders that go beyond where we were when we left off, I think is really important. The fresh, or maybe not fresh to some people in this room, but that I haven't heard mentioned today is some set of initiatives in the human rights and democracy space. So many have said that our comparative advantage now, and I think Neera alluded to this, with China stepping up in the world in such cataclysmic ways and such important ways, that we have a comparative advantage in human rights and democracy. How do we show that early? And just a few ideas. I mean, I do think it's the confidence deficit in democracies right now is something that we need to try to remedy early, and remember that 55% of the world's countries, even now, even with the freedom deficit for 13 years, 55% of the world's countries are still democratic. That's more than half of the world's population. Is there some big gathering of democracies? People who are involved in the community of democracies know that has never really had a huge impact. But whether it's ad hoc gatherings, regionally with democratic countries, but we need to be pooling our resources, pooling our ideas. Other countries are way beyond where we are now on combating foreign election interference, other democracies, that is. That's a topic for, let's say, a summit of democracies. Deciding who's in and who's out maybe creates a little race to the top. We all know from the Obama summits that everybody wants to be at a U.S.-chaired summit. And I don't think, notwithstanding all the damage of the Trump years, I think that will still be the case. So, getting a little energy back and pride in what it means to be a democracy and giving some texture to the benefits that can accrue in pooling our strength. And again, if you think about economically even, the US and the European democracies, how potent that front is in the face of the Chinese export of its model, to the degree that that's what it's doing, that coalition, that bloc, is, even with the Hungarys and the Polands and the caveats to it, it's a much more powerful presence, and to, again, get a little spring back in the step. Of course, in order to be credible in human rights and democracy, most of our work is going to be on our internal struggles and reclaiming the legitimacy of our efforts beyond our borders, and so the rule of law, the independence of the Department of Justice or the Attorney General, some of the things that were talked about earlier, the return to press briefings and an embrace of even an adversarial relationship with the press. All of those are going to be foundational to our human rights and democracy leadership. And then, like, there are small initiatives, but again, that could have outsized impact, like proposing legislation that, we have our coup legislation that we maybe didn't observe to the letter as we should have in the Egypt context, at least not for to my taste. But you could imagine, since coups are less the issue now than the extension of people's terms or the doing away of constitutional limits on executive power all around the world as part of this freedom recession, you could imagine, Tom Carruthers of Carnegie has proposed this, legislation that does what we once did for coups for those kinds of, constitutional transgressions that would have actual assistance ramifications. And then finally, I think something really big in the anti-corruption space, and this gets to marrying the domestic and foreign policy. There are people here who'd be more expert than me, but that's another example, like climate, where some kind of interagency where the full scope of our domestic tools and our international tools are brought to bear. I just read a statistic that 10% of leadership changes that occurred between 2013 and 2018 were fueled by public anger over corruption. And if you combine some of what's motivating progressive anger at the present, even some of what contributed to Trump's election, somewhat contradictorily, but the resonance of a sense that elites are making off with national wealth of all kinds, and the potential resonance of the work that we have to do to rebuild the rule of law here, and then to embed that in a big initiative and to get the democracies of the world who haven't strayed quite as far as we have on some of these issues, at least at a head of state level. That could be just a really powerful sort of signature initiative, I think, for a new administration that takes power, particularly at a time when the rule of law is under siege by some of these more autocratic tendencies, at a time when China is projecting this kind of deference to whoever the sovereign is, irrespective of whether they respect the rule of law, at a time when China itself is bringing corrupt practices to at least some share of its important infrastructure investments that it's making around the world. There could be a lot of distinguishing power, I think, in that agenda.
I want to pick up on continue the democracy, authoritarianism theme here. And, there seems to be a major paradigm shift happening. I mean, CAP put out a paper last year about having a democratic values-based foreign policy. You're sitting here on the stage today talking about how to pool collective democratic power to shape the world to our interests and our values. How should we be thinking about the other partners who are a little less democratic, like the Saudi Arabias of the world, who are not democratic, especially after a period of time where President Trump has been out there talking quite openly about how he prefers the sort of autocrats to the Democrats. So how do you think about partners like Saudi Arabia or others around the world who have challenges on the democratic side? How do we think about engaging in that space?
Well, again, some of this is to state the obvious. I mean, the power of our, with human rights diplomacy, sometimes your efforts, and this will be true in the future, even if it's a more signature part of future administrations' leadership in the world, partly as a reaction maybe to Trump, partly as a reaction to China. But it is the case that one of the main tools in your toolbox is diplomatic, is censure, is condemnation, and even the Trump administration does some of that. They just do it for Venezuela, Iran, who else? Cuba. Anybody else? Anybody else?
Philippines.
Bueller. No, they don't do it for the Philippines. No, of course they don't do it for the Philippines. No, so the tinniness of our human rights diplomacy at the outset is something that we're just going to have to work hard to redress, and it's going to take time. It took time after the Iraq War was waged in part under the mantle of liberty and freedom. It took time in the Obama administration. It's going to take even longer, I think, in the wake of Trump. But I say that just because back to my point about bringing democracies together. You know, I made the point in the context of a gathering, that's not important. What's important is that we function together, that we are a bloc, that when these kind of modest tools are brought to bear, and they need not be modest. I mean, there are certainly we should be cutting off assistance to the Saudis in light of the atrocities being committed in Yemen. I mean, there are like straight up cutoffs of support that are, I think, are imperative and have long been imperative. But on some of the other sort of less precipitous, you know, and dislocating tools that you would employ, the power will come in numbers, in part, and the power will come in showing ourselves, as well as those who are on the fence, as well as the authoritarian countries who have been strutting around for the last decade, really, but especially the last 3 years. You know, now we're doing these things together, and there's a lot of hedging going on. I mean, you know, countries like Greece, you know, used to but at the very end of the Obama administration, used to be able to barely pull them into human rights criticisms of China, barely, and now, like, forget about it. You know, the Chinese investments within a major European, within the founder of democracy, the heart of democracy, Greece itself, they don't want much to do with that. And so I don't want to pretend that you just, you know, hey, we're back, everybody ready to be a democracy club again, and it's not going to be like that. But I think to remember the power of numbers and multilateral coalitions, especially with China, you know, more and more, with governments like the Saudis and the Egyptians and others, more and more sort of dangling their options and their ability to forum shop. And we lived with that at the tail end of the Obama administration as well, you know, just the specter of, oh, but then they're going to go to Putin, or they're certainly going to go to China. And I think we need to get a little more comfortable, figure out where those lines are for us, and which you know, which countries would that actually harm our interests? Which countries has that ship already sailed, and where we're just offering, you know, sort of gravy because the major investments are coming from elsewhere anyway, and so we might as well have sort of principled positions. I mean, the extent to which Chinese investments and military sales, even at some point in the future, you know, will end up in any event, you know, kind of diminishing our leverage. It has been an argument for this keeping our iron in the fire, and we got to maintain the relationship using, you know, just funneling more and more economic assistance to Sisi and to whomever. But maybe at a certain point, it's like, you know, at this point, that assistance, we can now look plainly at it. China has come, Russia has come. They've made their bed. They've chosen that relationship, and each of these, I think, is a case-by-case situation. But I would say on the positive side, which is, you know, I suppose easier in many ways, but you know, I mentioned the importance of us sharing lessons learned on election interference, and banding together on the Uyghurs would be one example of where, if you're going to do a public statement, do it in unison with as many other countries, democracies, and human rights respecting countries as you can. But it's also thinking really strategically about Sudan, Ethiopia, even Tunisia, you know, all these years after its transition. Is there a way to pool resources with an eye to really investing at critical times in countries that are trying to make transformational change? I mean, everything they're doing in Sudan is it's just pushing water uphill. And they're doing it with the occasional, you know, kind of low-level statement out of the State Department saying, you know, and then the occasional, then Pompeo, like, trying to claim credit for the transition in Sudan. But there's no process, there's no strategy, there's no, how could we bring, you know, even, you know, begin like thinking about business investment at a certain point, or back to anti-corruption. How can we offer technical expertise, whether at a civil society level or at a governmental level, to really assist them where they need it most in capacity building for an experiment that a year ago nobody in Sudan would have dreamed that they would have the chance to be embarking upon. And so part of the conversation about what do you do about democracy and non-democracy is, really throwing your weight behind those who can be your friends, but who are at critical junctures and feeling right now immensely lonely. China's there, right? Offering no strings attached, infrastructure. They've been there.
There are strings.
Yeah, exactly. A different kind of string, but no human rights strings attached, no democratization strings attached. I mean, one interesting just side note on Sudan, because I think it could be, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about, again, anything that's happening internally there beyond saying nobody could have expected that they would have come this far. And I think we'll talk at some point maybe about multilateralism and sort of where it stands, but the UN Security Council, because of China's support and Russia's support for the Bashir government, was completely useless as these earth-shattering events were taking hold. And because the Security Council was paralyzed on Sudan at a time when the body charged with promoting and protecting international peace and security could have been helpful, it was just sort of like off, irrelevant. But it freed up space for the African Union to do something really positive and constructive. But it created for the first time a situation which may be something we see in the future, one could sort of hope on one level, but where the African Union and the Chinese were at each other because the African Union wanted to go farther in pushing for civilian-led government in Sudan, and the Chinese just wanted status quo and, don't cut, preserve what you have. The investments have been made. Things are working out for us quite nicely. And just this, again, statism or this bias toward whoever's in charge, irrespective of what they're doing. But right now, or at least in recent years, it's been kind of the last few years has been open season for China in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, and Latin America in many respects. But this was an example where you see actually a new, I don't want to call Ethiopia a democracy, but a country going through a democratic transition or seeking to, then itself stepping up under the auspices of the African Union to then try to facilitate another democratic transition that few saw coming, and even elbowing out of the way the authoritarian big brother who wanted to use the powers of the international system to preserve the status quo. And I think there are people here who really have studied it closely, but I think in that lies some reminders of how things could work, actually, if one of the world's potentially leading democracies, the United States, was back in the game. Others could argue it the other way, which is that it is this vacuum that creates the prospect for things like that to happen. But with the change in Ethiopia, leadership on behalf of democracy and human rights, and again, all kinds of problematic things happening in Ethiopia as well, but the support for rule of law, the aspiration to deal with historic grievances, the increased liberalization, at least for political parties, media liberalization, so forth, you can imagine when countries are going through that, they want company. And the regional organizations can end up asserting themselves even as the UN and other more traditional bodies where we have played end up taking a back seat because of the gridlock between the United States and China.
I mean, it's an interesting question because, obviously you've been ambassador to the United Nations. You're speaking of gridlock, that is going to persist, I suspect, worsen now that we're in this era of great power competition. So really, how do you balance investments and working through international institutions like the United Nations with kind of the new ad hoc multilateralism that we're starting to see emerge, whether it's coalitions of democracies or just broader coalitions in general? What's the right balance of that? What does that look like? And then if you lean in too far to ad hoc multilateralism, do you create a world that is a more competitive place? You have competitive blocks, which is something that we've seen in the past in history that hasn't been as good. So how do you balance, as progressives, working both inside institutions that may be hamstrung by politics and then working outside them?
Well, we're definitely moving into a both and. I mean, we're not moving into, we're in that. I mean, just for context, if you think of old school gridlock in the Security Council, you immediately think of the Cold War and the sort of paralysis between the US and the Soviet Union kind of shut down the functioning. But with the end of the Cold War and the kind of opening up of the possibility of the Security Council being a quasi-executive organ on peace and security, you had a couple decades there where it was irrelevant at times on issues where permanent members felt really, really strongly. So the Security Council is not impactful really on issues related to Israel-Palestine because of the U.S. traditional position within the Security Council. Certainly anything related to Taiwan or membership issues, UN membership issues, or Burma for a long time, the kind of near abroad for China. Then in the Obama years, because of what Putin was doing, you saw the list of things that you kind of couldn't make progress on, list of issues coming before the Security Council expanded on one level, but then the issues on which you couldn't get past great power differences really expanded because suddenly Ukraine is on the agenda and yet there's very little you can get through the council because of Russia. Syria, bright line, almost as if it's Ukraine, Putin treating it as if it's near abroad. Adding to that, then Yemen in the tail end, where I think in many ways Russia's position, at least on the inclusivity, the peace process, and so forth, which led it to block different actions, might be a position more along the lines of what people in the room today would wish our position had been. But it was mainly just to be spoiler also and to try to create an equivalence between what the coalition was doing in Yemen and what Russia and Syria were doing in places like Aleppo. But Yemen suddenly, then Burma again with the Rohingya, it's off limits. Now, today, so many of the other crises, it's just blocked. Libya, Iran, Kashmir, of course. And so pretty much, if you think of a conflict in the world, it's someone's got a dog in the fight now to an extent. And I mentioned even Sudan, where China and Russia were on one side and Western democracies were sort of on another, but not very assertive. And so it's more and more blocked on more and more issues. And that was a real shift I saw over even the life of our time in the Obama administration, where Putin was initially, it was just Ukraine and Syria where he was gonna, throw his weight around. And then suddenly he wanted to play spoiler on the South Sudan arms embargo. He never cared about what was happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Those were ones he would just not pick a fight on, and yet he was personally vetting Security Council resolutions on issues much further afield, just to be the disruptor writ large. And similarly, China, within the UN system, you would have just seen it very, very active on things that mattered to China, keeping itself off the agenda above all, keeping anything related, again, to its very, very near abroad off the agenda, and then preserving a constructive space on North Korea, which was always somewhat surprising, the willingness to work within the Security Council on North Korea proliferation-related issues. But by the end even of my time, and this has been totally accelerated in the last 3 years, China, in 2009, when we entered the Obama administration, China was contributing, I think, 3% of the UN budget. And last year, for the first time, it became the #2 donor to the United Nations behind the US. So it's now at 12%. It overtook Japan, which gave it special pleasure, China. And that translated already, again, 3 years ago, but it's translating every day now into a willingness to assert itself across the budget process, trying to cut human rights posts from peacekeeping missions, trying to, some of you read about how China threatened to veto the UNAMA, the UN Afghanistan mission, kind of re-up of the UN mission, a pretty pro forma resolution, because they couldn't get their Belt and Road, the complement to the tribute to the Belt and Road Initiative and how constructive and important it is for Afghanistan, into the UNAMA renewal resolution. Just throwing weight around to ensure that this sort of very gradual, and it's hard to see its impact on the world as we know it, but they're up to something, but very gradual erosion of standards by inserting language around state consent everywhere, kind of chipping away at the idea that there are principles within the UN Charter that are higher than the state, the human rights principles to which states have to be accountable. If you look at UN resolutions now, just look at the language around state consent. That's a sort of, and so in the Security Council, these kinds of battles are happening, this kind of assertiveness is going on, and meanwhile, the problems aren't going anywhere in the world, and so there's a kind of organism adapts dimension to what is happening, and again, that predated Trump, with ECOWAS taking a leadership role, for example, on the constitutional crisis in the Gambia back in 2016, the Ethiopia role through the AU on Sudan. You're going to see more and more of that. But to your question, the way that you will start to see any of these institutions, including sub-regional African institutions, the AU, or the Security Council, it will turn on how the countries themselves, how those bilateral relationships are faring. There's nothing in the multilateral ether that fixes itself. It's not like the Secretary General shows up and is like, guys, like enough gridlock. We're back to kind of Cold War veto number. What are you guys doing? All these pocket vetoes. No products are coming out on any of the contemporary crises. You're making yourselves irrelevant. I mean, people are very aware that the Security Council is losing legitimacy for reasons other than having 5 permanent members selected in 1945, right? That used to be the big legitimacy concern about the Security Council. Now it's that it's just on the big crises of our time, it's not functioning, but that's gonna come back to the China relationship, the restoring all your breakout sessions, and those all resolving themselves, because then as democracies are back cooperating, right now the democracies on the Security Council aren't even really caucusing with one another. I mean, the E3 are, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom are aligning their messages, but the United States decided in the wake of North Korean ballistic missile tests that we didn't want to bring those violations of Security Council resolutions to the Security Council. The Europeans did. They were like, wait, last I checked, that's a violation of Security Council resolutions, and brought them over U.S. objections. I mean, the idea that we're in a moment where the U.S. and our closest European partners would be disagreeing about whether to bring North Korea's violations to the Security Council. The cleavages are not just on human rights and democracy issues or women's rights or all the ones we know about. It's even on the core peace and security questions.
Yeah. I have so many questions to ask you, but I know that the audience also wants to ask you some questions. I do have one question before we go to the audience, which is, you're returning to teaching. Congratulations to your students and to you.
Yes.
One of the things, CAP has done polling around foreign policies and how they resonate with foreign policy issues and how they resonate with Americans. And what we have discovered is through that, there's significant generational divides on what we consider important and not important in terms of our role in the world, what issues we should be focused on. You're engaging young people now. How are you thinking about this generational shift in terms of priorities, but also how we can engage a younger generation on foreign policy issues in a way that resonates with them?
Let me answer in 2 ways, if I may. I mean, first, at a sort of generic level, it gets back to where we started on this idea of shrink the change. I both am teaching and just completed a 3-month book tour where I was in 40 cities or something, and on a lot of campuses. And I don't know if this will resonate. I feel like this is true of people of all ages, actually, and not just of students. But my main impression was a level of political engagement, activation, anger in certain quarters that I don't recall seeing in my prior, travels and my prior experiences in the classroom. But it was coupled with a real anxiety, a sense of feeling small. So it was like the problems. It's almost like Australia's fires become a metaphor for this, even though I was in Australia at the time of the fires and not on American campuses. But it's just, it's just even just the images. And as a parent, I mean, all of you who are parents, like talking to your kids about these problems, and a parent's job is to kind of tell a story about how everything's going to be okay. And how do you tell a story? And that is true of climate, but it's the set of issues whether inequality or the opioid crisis or the, mass migration. And it's really caring, and then really just sort of, when you right-size the solution with your own capacity. And so that's where the shrink the change things comes in, where we're trying to meet people where they are, not paralyzed, but activated and then kind of hamstrung by that doubt. So I think that's well beyond what anyone thinks our foreign policy should be. I think as we think about the kind of activation we need society-wide for the set of challenges that we face, just to remember that simply stating the size of the problem without finding, for those of you who are experts on issues, without finding some pathway where you can tell a story that there is something within your power to control, because people feel out of control. I guess that's another way to put it, commensurate to the scale of those issues. So that's just part of my reaction to your question. And then the second and last thing I'd say is I think the CAP poll is really interesting. And there's Pew polling also that I think is quite similar. So, and it's what we all know, right, which is that younger people are much more skeptical than older generations about the use of military force. Our challenge collectively is there does appear in many circles a conflation of US leadership in the world or US foreign policy with using military force. And so, again, when you're talking to people, you're reminding, we're not just the country of the Iraq invasion, we're also the country of leading the world to end the Ebola crisis. I mean, when I teach that case at the Kennedy School and the law school at Harvard, I mean, people are just like, they come out there like, bouncing to the hall. Just the fact that there's an example that's concrete and now well documented by scholars about how a democracy working behind and in support of local people who are willing to put their lives on the line in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, but how all of the countries of the world, when a democracy leads in support of those individuals on the ground, can build the airplane while it's flying it. They're like, we'd forgotten we can do those kinds of things. So in other words, you can't wish away the fact that people have lost confidence. You can't wish away or simply say, oh no, you're conflating. You're forgetting, we helped spearhead the Paris Agreement. We helped, neutralize Iran's nuclear weapons program and in elaborate and incredibly complex negotiations while bringing Russia, China, the Europeans, and Iran to the table in a way that nobody thought possible. When you give them those examples, they're like, oh yeah, But those examples are not part of our political culture, right? We have American carnage, we have nothing that the last administration did ever worked, which seeps in even among Democrats. Just that a lot of what I've talked about, I guess, today has been about confidence. So, but I will say that the CAP poll and the Pew poll show something really interesting. The CAP poll, if I'm not mistaken, you'll correct me, but with jobs, climate was number one. This is, Generation Z, I guess they call it. But so for the younger crowd, you're talking about climate number one, jobs, and then allies, getting to Favreau's polling also. And then number four was protecting human rights. And I think it was protecting human rights and ending global poverty. And then lower than that was terrorism, combating terrorism among young people. And so it's not that they want to throw baby out with bathwater if you disaggregate, but if you talk in the abstract about US foreign policy, I think everybody just thinks that's going to mean militarization. And there's a reason for that. Our personnel are involved in counterterrorism operations in 40% of the country's counterterrorism missions, which include operations and other activities, training and other activities, in 40% of the countries in the world. And so there's a sense of how our foreign policy, has become overweighted, in that direction.
Completely agree, and we have a breakout session on ending the forever wars, so. I want to open for at least a couple of questions. I know we're running a little bit behind, so if folks have questions, please raise your hand, and I will collect two of them in the beginning here. The gentleman in the back. at the table here. And please state your name and identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Matthew Petty. I'm a reporter at the National Interest. So one thing I've heard a lot of from kind of Trump world is the idea that the clock is ticking to, one talking point I've heard is force a decision point on Iran. And, you know, we've seen like the Europeans start to move away from the nuclear deal. We saw serious military escalations. What do you think a new Democratic administration should do if the Trump administration brings us past a point of no return? What do you think the way to deal with getting stuck into, let's say, an escalation spiral that the next administration might not believe is justified or wise is if we're already in it? Thank you.
Okay, and take another one. Lady in the front here. Suzanne?
Hi, thanks so much. That was great. Question about the UN and sort of, you know, from its founding, the UN has sort of both had this kind of collective action dimension and a normative dimension. And it seems like both those elements of the institution are in crisis and in retreat. And some analysts sort of think they're in juxtaposition, and that by sort of stressing and trying to shore up the normative side of the UN, you're weakening the institution, in that Russia and China do see an incentive in participating, in some respects strengthening the UN, but on their own terms. And you know, my view is you got to do both. You have to strengthen the UN as an institution for collective security, but you cannot give an inch on the normative side. You have to continue to compete, and you know, ultimately I think we can be successful. But I'm curious sort of how you see that, and particularly the sequencing, because if we go aggressively on the normative side, you know, I can see that that is a recipe for continued impasse.
Why don't we start with those two?
Okay. Let me work backwards. You know, I'm not sure, Suzanne, just at a level of abstraction exactly where to go with your question. I think you're absolutely right to point to the interplay and to the duality of all of that, of collective action and normative. But, I mean, in order to defend against norm erosion, which is really more, maybe I'll say a word about the technology norms and that bucket of norms that are woefully underdeveloped. But if part of what is happening and going to continue to happen is going to get accelerated over time, is to chip away at some of the belated realizations that the way a regime treats its own people is a predictor of how they are likely to behave within their regions or as partners. I mean, China just fundamentally either doesn't accept that or doesn't care, right? Because the ramifications of accepting that events that occur internally have broader ramifications just implicate them too much, right? And now implicate a set of bedfellows of theirs. So if you are to guard against their desire to kind of turn back the clock, I mean, which kind of mirrors what Trump has tried to do domestically here, then it's about countries acting collectively to prevent that norm erosion. And one reason they've been so I mean, we're fortunate that their ambition in the phase that coincides with Trump is nascent. And you know, I know there are divergent views about even how ambitious they even are to this effect, you know, whether they coexistence with the international institutions largely as they are, chipping away here and there, or whether they have something, whether they want to make the world safe for autocracy or authoritarianism. I mean, I think they're really, it's not actually clear yet where they're heading, but wherever they're heading, you'd prefer them to be at a nascent stage during the Trump era where the US seat is vacant in pretty much every negotiation, and where the US doesn't mobilize other countries and doesn't either care to do diplomacy or doesn't understand multilateralism and its utility to US interest. For whatever reason, we're lucky that it's now. We would have been luckier if it was 10 years ago when they weren't doing it at all, but But, this is where, again, 2 times Trump is not 2 times Trump. It's, it's an exponential harm that occurs in a second term because China, more and more, as I spoke to. So just need collective action to preserve norms. And then when you look at that bucket of new norms, and it need not and maybe best not happen, at least initially at the UN, but in any multilateral setting, it's still going to be about collective action on behalf of a set of principles that we wish to espouse, that we will probably, if we were to ever get China to be a part of them, and for cyber and AI and others, you absolutely have to, or that would be the point. There'll be some compromise involved in that. And again, the longer we wait, the more leverage they will have, the more countries they will have on their side of the table, right, who are the beneficiaries of these technologies. So I guess I see them just very, very intermingled. And I will say, on norm development, I mean, and I hope that my way of thinking about it isn't already anachronistic. I don't know, because I haven't been in these negotiations, now for a while, and the world has not stood still during this period. But it is probably the case that on the big unresolved normative questions where China has to be part of the conversation, that the process will end up having to look something like, I'm saying this tentatively, but the Paris process, where a kind of P2 negotiation occurs, as happened, in the Podesta process or whatever with President Xi, and then, but it could happen the other way, where it's a democracies process that occurs, where we are then the spokesperson on behalf of as large a coalition as possible, giving us then more potency in what amounts to a subsequent P2 process. That's why I mentioned that in year one, all of that brainstorming among democracies about how we handle this strategic juggernaut that is coming down the path. But I say that in contrast with the traditional UN process, where it's kind of bottom up. The U.S. is kind of leading behind the scenes like that. You can't get away with that anymore. It's not going to play itself out at the UN. It may end up at the UN. It should end up probably at the UN. We tried that in the Obama years with a lean set of cyber norms. And I think from what I gather from the intelligence people, it brought down cyber theft and some of the things we were looking at, but we didn't touch the hottest issues, I guess, or the most contentious issues. And that was the idea, was we'd start there and then we'd build out. Something like that kind of process is going to be needed. And then on the Iran question, I don't think I have I think it's just, there's two, I can't even know what scenario you have in mind exactly. I guess I would just say you use the phrase point of no return. I just will never, I don't know what that means. It can always get worse, right? No matter how bad it is, it can always get worse, and it can always get moderately better, right? Anything, this is where climate stands out as a possible exception. But so I don't know what the apocalyptic scenario is that you have in mind. I think we will have two profound issues, irrespective of sort of how the next months play themselves out under Trump. We will have a major credibility challenge in sitting down with the Iranian regime again, insofar as the ready response to whatever reboot we want to do is, yes, but won't this too be replaced the next time someone who doesn't like the deal takes office? And in the old days, we would either have the norm that Dennis referenced earlier of respecting an executive's prior agreements, or we would have the prospect of locking down an international agreement in a treaty. But, given the 67 vote threshold for treaties, we don't do treaties anymore. We'll be lucky on New Start. But so I think it's going to be very challenging to sit down. On the other hand, the circumstance in Iran that is, helping fuel these protests, alongside the recent trigger event of shooting down the plane and the lack of credibility around the regime generally in terms of Iranian welfare, but is a profound economic crisis. And so that crisis is going to persist irrespective of whether escalation or de-escalation occurs, especially because the Trump administration is intent on just piling more and more sanctions, not only on the Iranian regime, but on anyone externally who complies with international law and the sanctions relief that the JCPOA, as enshrined in UN Security Council resolution, anybody who complies with that, the Trump administration is treating as a rogue actor in the international system. And so the economic pain, piled onto Iran is going to be a major change in circumstance with huge ramifications for their internal stability. And we've seen that in this week's protest, but also in the largest protest since 1979, which occurred, just weeks ago. So it's very hard to speculate given the number of moving parts in that set of scenarios.
And we're going to have a panel later this afternoon to solve all the problems on the Iran front. Well, thank you, Samantha, for joining us. I'm sorry we don't have more time for questions, but it's been a very in-depth conversation about how to advance our ideals in a very complex world. So thank you for joining us, and if folks can give her a round of applause.
Thank you, everybody.
We're now going to break for the afternoon breakout sessions, so we'll see you